My departure, just very quickly, and then like we don't need to discuss it. Just say it, and then let's
Yeah.
just do the labor secretary. Is there one you like?
Um,
Gladiator 2, I haven't seen. Do you want
what's
to do
that?
something light?
I mean,
Gladiator 2.
I
Here,
haven't
let me
seen
see.
it either. I
I
mean, we
haven't
can
either.
talk about the Bhattacharya as well as the
Oh,
labor
yeah.
secretary.
Yeah, two good appointments.
And
Yeah.
then, as far as light, yeah, I don't know. I don't
Why
really.
don't we do like just three appointments, like two wins, one disappointment? Percent is
Yeah,
something like
sure.
that.
Okay,
Okay.
sounds good. So, do you want me to host?
Yeah.
Okay. So, should I
Put a
just turn it
nice.
over to you to make the announcement, or
Yeah.
okay? All right. Hello and welcome back to the Compact Podcast. I'm Geoff Shullenberger. Matthew Schmitz is out today, and I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari. So, to begin, we have a major announcement regarding Sohrab's. Sorry, this is. Stephen, cut that part. So, to begin, we have a major announcement from Sohrab, so I will turn it over to him to make that announcement.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Just as many of our readers and subscribers probably saw on X, the app formerly known as Twitter, I am departing Compact after 3 years to go work for a publication that we used to describe on this podcast as a publication that shall not be named because it had a friendly rivalry, namely Unheard, going to head up their U.S. edition as U.S. editor, and so I'm very excited. But it's a moment of transition for Compact, but it will it has endured. It's become an institution, and it's in very good hands with my best friend and partner Matthew Schmitz, who will lead, and of course Geoff Shullenberger himself, our managing editor, and Stephen Adebato, our editorial fellow. They will continue to push Compact forward and up to new heights. And I'll be around for a little bit longer. So I'm going to be on probably like 3 more podcasts after this. So you will not be rid of me so easily.
So, Sohrab, we will miss you, but congratulations on this move, and I'm sure we'll have opportunities for dialogue and collaboration in the future. So, in the meantime, to the business of the day, Donald Trump continues to fill cabinet posts. So we'll begin with a quite significant one that Compact weighed in on prior to the announcement last Friday, which was the appointment of the labor secretary nominee, Lori Chavez de Reamer. So, Sohrab, we did publish a piece on this subject, and it is something we had been attuned to and paying close attention to. So, perhaps you could summarize the significance of this pick and what it might signal about labor policy going forward in this administration.
Well, I'll start with its significance for Compact as an institution, which is namely the fact that, um, uh, as you alluded to, Jeff, we published an op-ed by no less a figure than Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters, endorsing Representative Chavez de Reamer for this role. And, you know, 36 hours later came the announcement that she had indeed been tapped by President-elect Trump to serve as his Secretary of Labor. And so it's a clear institutional win for the kind of politics that Compact has spent the past 3 years advancing and will continue to advance in years to come. And just as a sign of that is the fact that if you look at any number of uh, pieces in other publications describing the pick, Compact is mentioned as the place where Sean O'Brien went to endorse Representative Chavez de Reamer. including by my former colleagues at the Wall Street Journal editorial page, who are very unhappy with the selection because they see her as a toady of the labor unions, which of course they hate. But they did mention the fact that she was endorsed in Compact. It was all over Politico and Bloomberg as well. The fact that the endorsement came down in the pages of Compact. So institutionally for Compact, it's just a sign of the pull we have on certain issues. Uh, in terms of the broader labor ramifications, I think it's huge. I mean, if you really think about it, you have a Republican Secretary of Labor designee who supports the labor movement's number one legislative priority, which is the PRO Act, the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which is a law that's aimed at reversing nearly three generations of the hollowing out of the New Deal labor order. Um, as you know, the grounding law of American labor relations is the National Labor Relations Act, otherwise known as the Wagner Act, enacted in 1935. And however, the idea was, and it's in the preamble of the act, that Congress wants to organize labor. It wants to promote collective bargaining, and yet, almost as soon as it was enacted, of course, corporations. Uh, Sorry, guys, I got to text my wife just really quickly, just because she's wondering, like, can she come in? And I just want to say yes. Sorry, Zach. So, sorry, Stephen. Please, I was just gonna let her uh, go. It's distracting me. Okay, Stephen, if you don't mind cutting all that, but just before I started saying, almost as soon as the act was passed by Congress, you can imagine employers went to war against it with the first of all the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, which gave a kind of symmetrical free speech right of the employers to counteract labor organizing, and then a series of decisions by mainly conservative Supreme Court justices and or Republican appointees to the National Labor Relations Board that kept chipping away at this organizing right and the sort of goal that we want collective bargaining in the workplace. So you had decisions where companies could hold what's called captive audience hearings, where they scare employees of what would happen if they vote to join a union. The union organizers cannot speak at captive audience meetings. Even employees can be barred from speaking at captive audience meetings. Union organizers cannot access the parking lot of work sites to try to reach workers except in certain circumstances, and so on and so forth. Just these little, like, chipping away at the National Labor Relations Act. And the PRO Act is aimed at reversing this hollowing out of the NLRA. And of course, the union movement, the labor movement, supports it, but not many Republicans do. But Representative Lori Chavez DeRemer, a Republican of Oregon, is not only a supporter of the act, she's one of only three Republicans to actually uh, sponsor the act. Every bill has a series of sponsors, and she's one of its sponsors. So that's just, like, earth shattering. It's really big. And, like, on this podcast and in pages of Compact, we've complained about some of the nominations on economic issues, and we will talk about that as well, like Treasury and others, where it seems like the old neoliberal type consensus of the right is getting some key appointments, but then this one is really, really important. And it's a culmination of the work by a very small group of GOP lawmakers who tried to make uh, the party a little bit more friendly to organized labor. I'm thinking of Senator Rubio, now Secretary of State designee Rubio, who backed organizing drives at Amazon. I'm thinking of Senator J.D. Vance, now the Vice President elect, who joined picket lines and at United Auto Workers strikes and elsewhere. And of course, above all, I would say, is Senator Josh Hawley, who's a Compact contributor. What Hawley did was he set the groundwork for this endorsement. because as Sean O'Brien told me in the piece that I did, an interview piece I did with him uh, for Compact, you can find that it's called Sean O'Brien's Brave Gambit. He said, like, how did I become kind of curious about working with Republicans? It's because, Josh Hawley called me up and said he wanted to meet. And then they had a series of small trust building steps. Hawley, for example, supported this NLRB determination, National Labor Relations Board determination, that Amazon truck drivers are employees for the purposes of like employee protections. Why? Because Amazon, of course, wants to treat them as contractors, so it doesn't have to give them any kind of workplace protections that are typically associated with employees. But um, Hawley was the sole Republican to support this view that given the degree of control that Amazon exerts over everything about the working lives of these drivers, it can't treat them as contractors, that it has a kind of power of co-determination that makes them employees. So moves like that, with Hawley especially, led to O'Brien speaking at the Republican National Convention, and then to his endorsement again in our pages, and then to this nomination. So look, are there uh, all sorts of threats to this kind of labor GOP rapprochement? Yes, including threats that come within the MAGA sphere. Yes, but it's still very significant. And again, I think I can't help as I record almost in an emotional register my one of my final few podcasts with Compact, that this was a Compact institutional win. We, put our weight in a really big way behind this nomination, and it just shows that like Compact's brand of politics and Compact itself as an institution are bound to endure.
So just wanted to point to another piece relevant to this that just came out in our pages, which is Alex Hogan's "Which Side Are You On, Don?" which brings up the organizing effort you referenced just now, Sohrab, involving drivers who are subcontracted by Amazon for delivery, who have been attempting to organize with the Teamsters, and then there's been a sort of legal battle around this, essentially pitting Jeff Bezos and Amazon against the Teamsters. And this does kind of point directly to this fracture line within the coalition, as Hogan discusses. And it's worth noting here, Jeff Bezos notably quashed the attempt by the Washington Post to endorse Kamala Harris. So he clearly, was reading the tea leaves and thought a Trump win was likely, or at least strongly possible, and wanted to remain on the good side of the incoming administration. And so clearly, Bezos is, even though he's historically been seen as a sort of Democratic aligned oligarch, he also is going to attempt to use the goodwill that he managed to gain from this move to exert some sort of influence. And of course, there are plenty of sort of like-minded people within the administration. So there is an interesting, basically sort of capital labor conflict internal to the cabinet and the administration as it's taking shape. So in relation to that, it's perhaps worth discussing the long-awaited appointment of Scott Bessent, who is not the candidate Compact endorsed. We published a piece by you, Sohrab, supporting the nomination of Robert Lighthizer, the former trade representative, for Treasury Secretary. I think, knowing that this was a long shot, it's certainly likely that a Lighthizer appointment to Treasury would have been seen by markets as an extremely telling move, and probably would have caused a significant panic, because Lighthizer is known as primarily as a trade hawk. We've covered his career in several pieces, so I would point people to Sohrab's recent endorsement of his candidacy for Treasury, but also to a piece by Justin Vassallo from some time ago that goes over his career and significance, as well as compact editor Matthew Schmitz's New York Times op-ed about Lighthizer. So he's an extremely interesting figure in terms of Compact's brand of sort of economics, and unfortunately did not get the nod. Instead, the nod was given to Scott Bessent, who seemed to have reassured the markets and been seen as a sort of safe choice. So I'm curious what you make of him and his potential role in the administration. I suppose the way I'm setting it up implies that, again, with the kind of capital labor conflict internal to the cabinet, I would place him on the side of certainly of capital. Um, he is a hedge fund guy, and he's somebody who clearly is on the kind of, I suppose, sort of socially and culturally left end of the MAGA sphere. He, in fact, as has been discussed, worked for George Soros. Did fundraising for Al Gore. According to a few things I've read, he basically supported liberal Republicans like William Weld, as well as sort of centrist Democrats like Gore in the 90s and early 2000s. He is a gay man married to a long term partner, husband, and it would seem that once the gay marriage issue was neutralized, he went over and became a sort of exclusively Republican donor. That's my understanding of his trajectory. So he is on the kind of culturally left end of the spectrum as far as Trump's coalition goes. He's a socially and culturally liberal, fiscally conservative Republican, which would, make him somebody who fits into certainly the general profile of the kind of GOP, much of the GOP donor class historically. Although, many of those people have actually been moving left towards the Democrats. So part of what's notable here is that Bessent, despite his, again, kind of social and cultural leanings clearly being more aligned with the Democrats, has become, essentially has attempted to, and successfully attempted to, ingratiate himself with MAGA world. So he's kind of gone in the opposite direction of many other oligarchs who share his socially liberal, fiscally conservative politics. So that's at least my sense of it. But I'm curious if you have more to add on his profile and what his position portends for the incoming administration.
Yeah, not much to add. I mean, he just strikes me as your typical Wall Street guy, right? And maybe he'll make a very skilled treasury secretary. I get that he gets capital markets. I respect that, but um, yeah, I just think, first of all, if this is about populism, then you don't, frankly, I mean, part of populism is that you don't have to worry, or you shouldn't worry, nearly as much about what happens, in financial markets as opposed to what happens in the real economy. So the choice of a Lighthizer would have been a Treasury Secretary who um, is committed more to the real economy, which over the past few decades has lost ground to financialization. That's one of our key financialization is one of our key problems, actually. And in my piece, Trump needs Bob Lighthizer at Treasury. I pointed out, and here I was channeling mainly I was channeling the views of various Trumpian trade hawks that I talked to, is that um, what Trump wants to do, if he wants to have a kind of import substitution, manufacturing led economy, then that needs a kind of legislative grounding, and it needs, for example, if we're going to give tax breaks to firms that manufacture in the homeland, that's not something that you can just sort of pass through executive order. It needs to be a kind of piece of bipartisan legislation, and and it just, in the same way that many of the kind of key elements of the New Deal order were bipartisan, it has to go through Congress. In the same way that many of the elements of the new liberal order was bipartisan legislative, You need legislation, and Bob Lighthizer is someone who could have gone in and banged heads together on Capitol Hill as Treasury Secretary to get this kind of comprehensive vision done. And so that's kind of what's missing from Basent. Nothing wrong with them per se, but just it's a bit of a missed opportunity. However, I will say, very pleased with the choice of U.S. Trade Representative. I had heard that Bob Lighthizer didn't want to just reprise his old role, which is why I believe he didn't get the nod. I guess you have to read tea leaves here, kind of criminology of Mar-a-Lago, but the person who was chosen, Jamieson Greer, he's right now a lawyer at King and Spalding, which is a firm that frequently represents U.S. manufacturers in trade cases, with the Commerce Department or in the courts, or with World Trade Organization. So it's a firm that services the manufacturing industry in a very close way. And of course, he had a role in. He was a sort of a deputy of Mr. Lighthizer's during the first Trump term. Uh, I just think he's a very, very serious profile as far as that goes. But still, it would have been nice to have someone of that mentality on Capitol Hill. I also just think I have this theory that the best Treasury secretaries that America has ever had have been non-financiers. So Hamilton himself, wasn't any sort of, and then James Baker, a very key guy. James Baker, not non-finance guy, so very good Treasury Secretary. And so I just wish that I like the thought of the person who oversees the fisc wouldn't have come from Wall Street, but it was not to be, at least not this time around.
So, on the more positive end, again, we were happy to see Jay Bhattacharya get the nod for directing NIH, National Institutes of Health. So Jay is, I would say, a friend of the magazine. He's somebody we've interacted with and has appreciated and shared our pieces in the past covering public health, COVID, etc. So congratulations to Jay. We did publish a piece by Stephen Macedo and Francis Lee endorsing him prior to his nomination, and I would recommend people check it out if they haven't. It's called Restoring Trust in Public Health. And Macedo and Lee point to him as somebody who, simply exemplifies the qualities you would want in a leader in the field of medicine and public health, including skepticism, openness to changing evidence, willingness to consider different hypotheses. And what's very strange is that in the course of the pandemic, he became a sort of pariah, largely for sticking to, pre-COVID era scientific principles, trying to avoid the politicization of science, and beyond that, advocating for an approach to pandemic control that largely resembled the standard plans that most governments and public health agencies had drawn up prior to early 2020. So, what's strange is that Jay is not a particularly, or should not be a particularly controversial figure, and yet he was, which reveals how strange things got during the high point of the pandemic, 2020 to 2022, which I would describe as a kind of mass hysteria of the expert class, in which longstanding principles and assumptions were simply thrown out the window for reasons that honestly remain somewhat obscure in some cases. I think it's often too easy to simply blame politicization in the context of U.S. politics, for example. Trump decided he didn't think the virus was that dangerous, so of course all the experts had to decide, had to conclude that it was, and so on. That's not to say that wasn't a factor, but it's also important to realize the global scale at which this entire phenomenon occurred. there are countries of very different political profile to the United States, which were not marked by a kind of partisan bickering over this set of questions, but that nonetheless, largely fell in line with this incredibly draconian new approach to public health, which was improvised and implemented in early 2020, and which had largely been ruled out and recommended against by most public health agencies prior to then. So I would say Jay is primarily somebody who just managed to keep his cool and stick to the longstanding principles of the field. Again, should not be a particularly controversial figure. And the fact that he was simply shows how badly things went awry in that field and area. So I do hope that his appointment does lead to some. Again, I still feel it's actually not fully understood why things went so badly awry in that period. And so I hope that one thing that will happen, because it is important that in the case of future, uh, you know, novel viruses circulating, that we do not see this kind of a reaction again. And so it is important that these institutions undergo a reckoning and a period of reflection and study to try to figure out what went wrong and to also measure the immense harms inflicted by these policies and come up with robust new recommendations that will avoid a repeat of all of that. So this is, I'd say, of the appointments so far, it's perhaps the one that makes me most hopeful, because he's simply a extremely thoughtful, solid, and reputable person who I think is the ideal person for this position. So I I feel after having been frustrated by the lack of reflection on what went wrong during the COVID years, I'm gratified to see that there is at least going to be some kind of shakeup, and also that this important agency is in the hands of somebody who I think really has just an impressive record over through all of these years. So I just was extremely pleased with this appointment.
Can't say more than that. I think just amen.
So again, it's I perhaps a final point to discuss just briefly is one one observation that's been made is that again this cabinet, it really has quite significant divides within it between capital and labor. I'd say between someone like RFK Jr., who is historically an advocate of the regulatory state, right, of the EPA, of the FDA. I mean, he's very critical of these agencies for being captured, but at the same time, has historically been aligned with, much of the Democratic Party in wanting them to do more to intervene and protect the health of the citizenry. And then you also have a strong anti-regulatory element within the cabinet as it's been nominated so far. And so you have really, quite a bit of conflict between these different approaches brewing. And one idea that's been proposed is it's best to think of this as sort of a something resembling one of these coalition cabinets that you have in parliamentary systems, right? Where members of parties that might have been opposed but have come into some kind of electoral coalition, come to occupy positions in the same cabinet, even as historically the parties they represent might have been opposed on some pretty fundamental issues. And so, I'm curious whether you think that's a useful analogy and what we might learn from it. And then, I think it also is interesting in terms of if that's true, it really speaks to the kind of hollowing out of the GOP as a coherent party. because it suggests that part of what Trump is doing is sort of just asserting his power to make decisions about who he wants to appoint, rather than, as I think we saw more in the first term, defer to the GOP apparatus to select the people who are actually going to run the government. And so that suggests really he's showing the strength of his hand within the system by choosing people who, like Chavez de Remer and like RFK for different reasons, clearly are at odds with the priorities of much of the kind of standard GOP apparatus, and thereby showing his own independence and his ability to remake the party. So that's interesting. On the other hand, kind of what it portends and adds up to in terms of these deep internal fractures within the cabinet is less clear. So I'm curious if whether you think that parliamentary analogy makes sense, and if so, what it might point to in terms of how this stuff will shake out.
Yeah, I like the parliamentary analogy. I guess sticking to my more familiar remit of political economy, I do see a sort of logic, which is um, deregulatory in one sense when it comes to, for example, the environment, all sorts of uh, green red tape, it might be cut, etc. And so it's this kind of libertarian element. And then, but then in terms of um, the external protection of the economy, barriers will be raised up, whether that's barriers to the free movement of labor or barriers to the free movement of goods. And so it's just this kind of, again, like I think I use this phrase which I borrowed from someone. My version of it was the version I had was external protectionism, internal libertarianism. Someone else called it libertarianism in one country. I think that's kind of what's shaking out, but the Lori Chavez de Remer pick kind of throws a wrench in the gears of that analysis because she doesn't tend toward libertarianism in one country or domestic libertarianism, but um, so yeah, I thought I had a coherent theory of what Trump was going for with this kind of mix of picks and impulses. Um, as I reflect on it, I think you might be right that he's just so far he's just asserting raw power, and there's a less of a kind of philosophical uh, orientation to it than people like you and me are want to try to read into things. Yeah, I remember, when Obama first came in, um, all these kind of MSNBC historians, obviously so laudatory and whatever, they called his cabinet a team of rivals. You remember this? Team of Rivals was I think it was the name of a book by one of these kind of pop
It's Doris
historians.
Kearns Goodwin, right?
Doris
It's on the
Doris
I
Kearns
think it's on
Goodwin,
the
Team of
Lincoln
Rivals.
cabinet. Is that right?
Right. And
Yeah.
they said Obama's assembling a team of rivals, but like, was he really? Like, they were all kind of, I think there's a real team of rivals being assembled here. Like crunchy, in a way, old left crunchy libertarian RFK, uh, whatever Tulsi is. Then you got like Wall Street guy Besant, tariff guy Jameson Greer, um, pro labor person. Right? That's a real team of rivals, um, and it's up to Trump to try to pull something coherent out of it, or just manage the economy, I guess, well enough that it just people are happy and his successor gets reelected, and then maybe we'll see something more kind of coherently intellectual than what we have now. So maybe
Yes.
I'll lean on an actual team of right. I think that phrase was inapt with regard to Obama, but is apt maybe with this cabinet information.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see, because I think the alternative is that you have something more like an emerging, analog of Peronism, where you have a kind of extremely motley coalition that is really organized around the force of personality of a charismatic leader. And then, of course, what happens with Peronism, well, for one thing, it has long, Perón gets it started earlier in life than Trump did, so it has longer to continue to persist kind of under his tutelage. But then at the end, famously, you have a like massacre where one group of Peronists basically massacres another at the airport when Perón is coming back to Argentina from Spain as an old man. And so, there's also the possibility that these factions actually don't coalesce into something ideologically coherent, but instead kind of lay claim in different ways to the personal legacy of the charismatic leader, but end up becoming sort of rival factions that interpret the true message of his leadership quite differently. So it'll be interesting to see how all this shakes up. And I do think we've entered into a new era, and what's taking shape now is going to define politics going forward in profound ways that are still pretty unclear. So it'll be interesting to observe. Any final thoughts, Sohrab? All
No,
right.
no, I think you bow tied it very nicely, and as always, I'm envious of the way that you seem to be able to speak in paragraphs, and so kudos. Like I think you just wrapped it up so nicely.
Well, thank you, and thanks for your contributions. Your presence on the podcast will be missed, but we have a few more episodes to look forward to. So, in the meantime, happy Thanksgiving to our listeners. Please check out compactmag.com for our latest articles. If you like what you're hearing, please. Ugh, sorry, I have a phone ringing. Um, okay, Steven, you'll have to cut that. Um, so cut that part. If you like what you're hearing, please rate and review on your favorite podcast channels. And also, if you are not yet a Compact subscriber, look out for a Black Friday deal, which will be announced at the end of this week. And we'll get you a great deal on a subscription going forward so you can read everything we publish. So thanks again, Sohrab, and thanks to you listeners. Until next time.